that's exactly alpha. So the reason that I called that other thing alpha is it's exactly the same as the Pareto coefficient. So as I said, this is like the most classic measure, one of the most classic measures of the top income shares is what the Pareto coefficient is. If 1 over the Pareto coefficient is large, that means that the top people are getting a lot of wealth. If the 1 over the Pareto coefficient is small, they're not getting very much wealth because the tails are much thinner, right? And alpha is approximately 1.5. You can just read that off of the U.S. income data. And so we can just plug that into the formula that we had, right? 1 over alpha, and then we've got the average elasticities. And for elasticities that are approximately 0.1, 0.3, 0.5, and 1, we get the optimal tax rate for 0.1 would be 87%, for 0.3 would be 69%, for 0.5 would be 57%, and for 1 would be 0.4. And this compares for similar elasticities to 67% for the general population, 48%, 38, and 26. So basically, it's going to be crucial how the elasticities for the rich differ from other people, but if they were the same, this would say we should have a very progressive system. So imagine the elasticities were the same, and they were 0.3, then the rich should be paying about 70% of their income above $1 million, whereas the average person should only pay 50%, right? And this just comes from the fact that inequality at the top part of the income distribution has been growing so much, while inequality in the main part of the income distribution hasn't been growing. And that's exactly, a main reason why you'd want to have a progressive tax. And it seems likely that if that is correct, if we do want to be charging the rich more, then the ramp up to, if we think about, you're going to charge people above $1 million something more, you might want to charge people above, a couple 100,000 something more as well. Probably you want to go gradually up from the tax rate that most people pay to the other tax rate. So you probably want to have several brackets in between. Okay. So there's a ton of evidence on elasticities, but it's pretty complex and not totally clear. The reason is that almost all the evidence we have is based on very short-term changes. So it's based on cases where, say, the government reduced the tax for 1 year or for a very small fraction of the population over a very short period of time, and we see, a tiny little thing, and we can then estimate off of that what the change in income was. But this can cause a huge bias upward in the earned income during the 1 year when the tax is higher and push it off to next year. That's quite easy to do. They just find a way to have their company defer their compensation to the next year and avoid the tax that way. On the other hand, it also biases things downward potentially, because if someone's thinking about switching into a better paying job or anything else that requires the reorganization of their life or their company, if the tax only changes for 1 year, they're not going to do that, right? So what has been found is that among the rich, the labor supply elasticity is extremely, extremely low. So the amount by which people reduce the amount of work when the taxes change in this short run way is essentially 0. It's less than 0.1. However, the amount of income they earn has a huge elasticity. So it reduces by about the amount that the tax change occurs. And same one? Yeah. Why do you think that might be? That even though the amount that they work doesn't change, the amount that they earn seems to change by a lot. These are really rich people, and the tax goes down for 1 year. And we see that the amount that they earn drops by a ton, even though they're working and doing all of the exact same stuff, apparently. Yeah, exactly. So it's really easy for rich people to hire great tax planners to make it look like their income was earned in a different year. even though they're continuing to do the same basic things. So there's tons of tax cheating, loopholes, tax shifting. Now, much of this could be addressed by closing loopholes in the tax code, a lot of people think. And to the extent that people are going to dodge the taxes by giving charitable donations, well, that's almost as good as raising taxes. So that probably shouldn't count against the elasticity. So the right number is likely probably 0.3 at the highest, and likely probably closer to 0.1 once the tax loopholes are changed and people can't shift income across years. That's probably the best guesses we have. For the middle class, labor supply and taxable income elasticities are both about 0.5. Because it's much harder for middle class people to find ways to shift their incomes across years than for rich people. And almost all of this elasticity comes from women's labor supply elasticity in married couples. So basically, it's almost never the case that the man stops working less, but in a married couple, based on what the tax rate is, sometimes the woman will start working or not. So what this suggests, if you plug those numbers into our formula, is that about 40% should be the average income tax that people pay, which is significantly higher than what we have. We have about 25. But that at the top, people should be paying about 80% of their income. And that it should be progressive on the ramp up to there. Now, that is a major change to the tax system we currently have. And so a natural question is the analysis that we just did wrong in some way? Or is the current tax system just wildly too low taxes, too regressive? Yeah.
I think an interesting point is that Warren Buffett's recent statements that I think he paid a total of like 17%, even though he's in the highest bracket.
Yeah.
So I think he was trying to show how these loopholes, how even where it doesn't seem like he might be doing it purposefully to try to like get away with not paying those tax, it just happens because of the system.
Yeah. So these are all things that this suggests we should reform. I'm pretty confident that the analysis we just did was internally valid. That is, we did all the calculations right, and I think the calibrations are about right based on the facts. But the question is, do you think that that means we should believe in such progressive taxes, or do you think there's really important things that we left out of the analysis? Well, let me try to go through some of the things that were left out of the analysis. I think this is quite an elegant analysis. It's very closely related to monopoly theory, right? The whole logic here was just, well, if we raise taxes, then we earn more revenue, just like if a company raises its price, it earns more revenue, but it reduces its sales, and so you have to trade those two things off, right? There's a bunch of things that were left out of the analysis. One is, who actually earns higher marginal utility for their income? The theory assumes that the poor people do, but that's not completely obvious. Imagine that some people are just more materialistic than others. Then you would expect the more materialistic people to make more money, and therefore those people might value their money more. So Robert Nozick has a famous example of, imagine that some people like watching sunsets and other people like watching movies, right? The person who likes watching movies is going to work harder, earn more money. The person who watches sunsets can afford to be a bum because he doesn't need to actually, make money to get to the movies. And a progressive tax system would redistribute from the person who likes the movies to the people who likes the sunsets. And that's not efficient, right? And you wouldn't even want to do that behind the veil of ignorance because the people who are working harder want the money more. Another important problem is, I talked about being behind the veil of ignorance and, you don't know which person you're going to be. That's actually a pretty complicated question because you could say the same thing like, I don't know whether I'm going to be incarnated as an animal or as a human behind the veil of ignorance. Why don't we treat animals nicely then or something, right? So I think most of us think that's silly because you can't imagine yourself having been at some point in the past potentially an animal or potentially a person, right? But you can imagine yourself having potentially been maybe someone you're sitting next to in class. But could you imagine yourself having potentially been someone in Africa? Or could you potentially imagine yourself potentially having been sort of an idiot? I mean, the thing is that we often would say it's a terrible waste if there's some brilliant kid born into a poor family who never gets to realize his brilliance, right? And we think that that is a waste, and we sort of would like to avoid that type of unfairness, right? But on the other hand, if someone's just born stupid, I don't think we say, oh God, it's a terrible waste that they ended up being born stupid, right? We think there's sort of some asymmetry we make between sort of what you're born with and what the world does to you, right? And we talk often about equality of opportunity rather than equality of outcomes, right? But what does equality of opportunity mean? It just means that whatever you got lucky to be born with, you're allowed to make the most out of. And so obviously we don't treat what you're born with the same way that we think of treating what happens to you during your life. So that leads to, that could also dramatically reduce the amount of redistribution we want to do. Another question is, do we include people who aren't born yet behind the veil of ignorance? Do we include people from other countries behind the veil of ignorance? That can have major effects on these things. Another thing that was left out is, one reason why we like redistribution is not just because of this veil of ignorance putting different weights on different people, but just because we don't like seeing lots of inequality around us. We don't like to be tripping over beggars in the street, right? That can lead to a very different dynamic of why we want to redistribute if that's our main motivation. In particular, you may have a harder time empathizing with or be less bothered by people starving in Africa than people starving on the streets of Chicago. And so that could lead to very different types of redistribution. And that would explain why we have much more inequality across than within nations. Okay. Similarly, many important positive considerations, just things about how the world works, were left out of the analysis. So for example, one argument I hear for inequality from a lot of my Princeton classmates who went into investment banking is that they were going to go and make a bunch of money and then they were going to redistribute, so they were going to spend that money on like starting a charity, running for political office, starting a company or something like that. So if it's true that the people who are best at making money are also good at like doing things that have lots of social benefits, right? Then it might, from a pure efficiency perspective, actually be good for the rich to get the money because they're going to spend it on doing all these other socially productive things. That depends on whether they're actually going to spend it that way and whether the people who are good at doing things like charity are also the people who are good at making money. But that's a classic sort of social Darwinist noblesse oblige argument from the 19th century. Another important thing is that when there's a lot of inequality, it can just cause social unrest. It can cause crime, it can cause violence, and so forth. And that might be one reason we want to reduce inequality. And that requires a totally different analysis than the one that we did. Another big issue is that poor people may not that much reduce how much they're working, but if you tax the poor too much on their marginal income, or you give them too cushy of a position absent earning any income, a lot of them will just not work at all. Right? They'll just completely drop out of the labor force. And so this is one reason why we have what's called the earned income tax credit, which is that you can get a huge amount more money by just working some than not working at all. And you can actually get negative marginal tax rates. So they'll actually subsidize, match your additional income in order to get you into the labor force. Another thing which you'll explore on the problem set, I don't know if anyone's looked at it yet, is externalities created by different professions. So I just listed off a ton of things. I think almost all of these factors are at least as important as the basic equity efficiency trade-off that we talked about today, and almost none of them are captured in any economics paper. So economics thinking about optimal taxation has been focused on this one very narrow issue, which is basically just an application of monopoly theory, as we found today. But if you guys want to write a senior thesis, there's like a ton of great things to think about.